like Hallmark Christmas movies. Like, we can all kind of admit it's basically the same story over and over and over again, right? And so I like to also read a lot of books, and there's this thing that will happen in some books or movies, and it's called the miscommunication trope. So it's something that is in the book or movie that is meant to create this conflict that has to be resolved before the end. And a common one is the miscommunication trope. And I'll just be honest, this is one of my least favorite. It frustrates me to no end. You've probably experienced it, right? You're watching a movie, and you've got this couple, and you know they're destined to be in love, but something is separating them, right? Because he just feels like he can't tell her about this part of his past, and she feels like she just can't tell him that she did this because of this over here, blah, 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 blah. And you are watching the movie, and you're thinking, or reading the book or whatever, and all I can think is, if you would just sit down over a cup of coffee, and if you were just to be honest with each other, all of this could be solved in 2 minutes instead of 2 hours, right? Right? That's kind of where I feel like we're at in the book of Esther, right? If Xerxes only could know what Esther knows, right? And if Esther could only just walk up to him and tell him, hey, here's what's up, right? We're kind of to that point in Esther where the tension has been built, and it feels like there has been so much tension and so much drama and so much desperation. And we are now, if you remember, Esther has gone to the king. She was granted the golden scepter. She did not lose her life. And finally the king asks her, what do you want? And she says, I would like to have a banquet. And so if you were with us 2 weeks ago, they had the first banquet. And the king asked her once again, Esther, what is your request? And for some reason she says, I would like to have another banquet, and then I will tell you. And for me as the reader, with this whole like miscommunication thing going on, I'm like, just spill the beans already. And so that's where we finally are today. So I'm gonna need some volunteers. I need 3 volunteers. They can be older kids or they can be grown-ups, but you have to be willing to sit up here for the whole sermon, okay? And I promise I won't embarrass you too much, okay? So I need 2 guys and 1 girl. Are you pointing at Michael? You volunteer. Who are you pointing at? Joe. Yes. Yes. Okay, so you get to come up, and since you volunteered first, you get to choose. No, you get to choose if you're Xerxes or Haman. I ain't gonna be Okay. Yeah, you know how today ends. Okay, so you're gonna sit right there. Okay, so really, please don't make me do this myself. Like, I need another dude, and you want to do it, Pete? I think you'd be so good. You even get to be the bad guy. Okay. You want to do? Hey, Callie. Do you think you can sit up there the whole time? I think you can. Do you want to be Esther?
Yeah.
Okay, come on. Let's do it. Okay. Okay. So you're going to hold this on, and I'm going to go ahead and let you get seated. I'm going to use this for a second. So today we're going to have a little fun with this passage because it's not really a fun passage, but we're going to try and make it fun. And it's family worship, and sometimes we'll fall on family worship in a place that I'm like, I wish this wasn't necessarily family worship, but we're going to make it work, okay? So speaking of watching movies, have you ever been watching a movie and you got to like go to the bathroom or get more to eat or whatever's going on, and you pause and the face is like, have you ever done that? Like you pause it and it's like, oh, do I make those facial expressions when I'm talking, right? So that's what you guys are going to be. You are going to be in your little TV screen today, and you don't have to hold it up the whole time because I'm sure your arms will burn eventually. But here's, here, can you hold it by like, I'll help. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. We're going to read the passage today, and at certain points in time, I'm going to say freeze frame. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to hit pause on the story. And we're going to pretend like if it was a movie, we're going to pretend we hit pause. And when I say freeze frame, I want you to give a facial expression that you feel like your character would be making. Okay? Okay, so you are Esther. You are Haman. You are Xerxes. Okay? All right, you think they can do it? Let's cheer them on. Tell them they can do a good job. They're going to do it. You can do it. All right, so Esther chapter 7, starting in verse 1. It says, "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, 'Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted.'" So let's practice. Not a lot has happened, but Xerxes is asking Esther a question. She's probably a little nervous. All right, so let's practice. Let's say freeze frame. Good job. All right. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Okay, finally, the miscommunication is hopefully going to be solved, and Xerxes has asked the question. Esther has finally given her answer. She is pleading for her life and for her people, and Haman we haven't heard yet, but you can imagine maybe how he might be feeling. So let's freeze frame. You guys are going to have to get a little bit more imaginative with your faces, okay? We've got some very non-emotional characters over here. Although, Callie, you're killing it. Good job. All right, so for Esther, so we have our Esther here. And finally, the thing that she has been praying and fasting and planning and waiting for the right moment and the right way, she finally is able to tell the king, "Hey, here's what's going on. Here's what's happening." And the way she does this reveals to us why it was so important for her to have fasted and prayed for 3 days. Because she gets to use this communication method that we find really recommended today. So have you ever been in an argument with someone, and now if you go to like a counseling or something and you're trying to work on your communication, they will tell you, make sure you use I statements, not you statements, right? So say I'm mad at Chelsea, right? There's a difference if I go up to her and I say, "I feel sad that you said this about me," or "I feel sad because blah, 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 blah." There's a way difference between me doing that and me being like, "Chelsea, you blah, 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 blah. You did this, you are that," right? There's a big difference, right? And so, shame on you. And so, notice that Esther does this. She says, "If I have found favor in you," right? "To save me and my people." And she's very generous. She's like, if we had just been sold into slavery, like I wouldn't even be talking to you. I feel like that's very generous, right? But she gives very like I statements. She never ever is like, "You the king, do you know what you have done?" Right? Which is very, very smart on her part, because she has to somehow illuminate the king to what Haman has done without making the king feel like she's attacking him or accusing him or doing something that will put him on the defensive, right? She wants him to have sympathy with her. So starting in verse 5, King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "An adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman." The way that this passage is structured actually mirrors another passage of Scripture When David has had adultery with Bathsheba, God sends the prophet Nathan to him. And Nathan tells the story, remember, of the sheep and of the man who had all the sheep and how he took the other man's one sheep. And if you remember, David gets very angry. Who would ever do that? Who is this person? They should be punished. And if you remember, Nathan says, you are that man. This passage in Hebrew is structured very similarly, right? Where Esther is saying, this terrible thing has happened. Our people are going to be killed and annihilated. And King Xerxes gets mad. Who would dare do that? Who would do that? Well, it turns out he had a part in that. But Esther says, an adversary and an enemy, the vile Haman. So freeze frame. Oh, I like that. Do you guys see this? This is a vile Haman. I like that. Very good. Very good. Are you in your villain era? Yeah. He is going to be in big trouble. I'm sorry for how this ends up for you today, Pete, okay? All right, I apologize in advance. So, the words that Esther uses here to refer to the villain in our story, to refer to Haman, are very important. She calls him the enemy and the adversary. And we've kind of talked about it before, about the role that Haman plays in this story is the role that the enemy plays in all of our lives. In fact, the word there for adversary is the Hebrew Satan, right? And Scripture tells us that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And then in this story, it tells us that Haman wanted to kill, annihilate, and destroy. And you see, if these things are the work of the enemy, stealing, killing, destroying, then when we see these things, and guys, we see these things in the world around us today, right? Stealing, killing, destroying, annihilating. When we see these things in our everyday lives, then we need to, as Esther does, call out the schemes of the enemy, right? And when we see these things, we know the enemy is at work. But sometimes, like Xerxes, we're blind to it. All of this has been happening right under his nose. And sometimes in our day-to-day lives, maybe we're too busy. Maybe we're too apathetic. We just don't care. Maybe we're caught up in ourselves. But the schemes need to be exposed and our eyes need to be opened. Okay, so now instead of freeze framing after, so Esther has just said that she's a Jew. We have no evidence in Scripture yet that Haman knew that she was a Jew. Whether he did or not, that's kind of up to speculation. But okay, he has plotted for the Jews to be completely destroyed. But now he has found out that the queen is a Jew. I want you to freeze frame. What about Xerxes? Xerxes didn't know. I want you to freeze frame. I'm dying. That's so good. Okay. All right. So let's see what happens next. It says, then Haman was terrified. Freeze frame. That's good. Before the king and the queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out to the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. So I want you to freeze frame. Remember, Xerxes has left in a rage, Joe. He's in a... Haman is begging for his life. And Esther, all right, I like it. I like it. So, I know, I like it. He's popping out into life. All right, so Xerxes leaves in a rage. And over the book of Esther, Xerxes being in a rage has happened over and over and over again, right? And, but we start to see a little bit of a shift here in Xerxes. Because Xerxes, so far in our story, has been very wrapped up in himself. A lot of the decisions that have been made in this book have been made while Xerxes was angry. But for the first time, we kind of see a little shift. Because so far, Xerxes has been enraged at someone. In fact, the word that's used here for rage, the only other time it is used is in chapter 1, when he is enraged at Vashti. And so we do see a little bit of a shift start to take place in Xerxes, because earlier he would get enraged. He was enraged at his wife and at his queen. And now we see a Xerxes who is enraged for his wife and his queen. So starting in verse 8, just as the king returned from the palace garden, this is the part that's not so family worship friendly, okay, so bear with me. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. And while I normally read from NIV, because we have kids in the room, I'm going to read from the NLT for this verse. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen while she is with me in the house?" So, he's been begging for his life. He's been out in a rage. She's just like, she's there, right? And he comes back in, and he is basically like falling all over her. So, freeze frame. I like it. All right, so just a little history. At that time in Persian culture, no man other than the king or maybe the eunuchs that worked with him, no one was ever to be in a room alone with a woman from the king's harem. So when Xerxes storms out in a rage, it would have been appropriate at that time for Haman to kind of like recuse himself from the situation. But he's so desperate that he's stayed to beg Esther for his life, right? Because he knows this is not ending well for me. And in fact, even when the king was in the room, another man was not to get within 7 steps of one of the women in his harem. So the fact that Haman is just begging for his life, but he's like right there, it looks really bad, right? He is like way out of line, and Xerxes, an already enraged Xerxes, would have come in and just become even more mad. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Freeze frame. Then Harbana, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." And the king said, "Impale him on it," or some translations say, "hang him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and then the king's fury subsided. Freeze frame. That's, Pete, I just really admire your All right, can we give them a round of applause? We're going to let them sit down. Thank you. You guys did good. All right. So here's what's really interesting about the story of Esther. And I think this can kind of even just illuminate to us sometimes how God works. Haman, after 7 chapters of watching him just be vile, I think that's a really good word. Esther uses a good word to describe him, right? Finally gets what's coming to him. But here's the thing. He doesn't get it for what he actually did. Did you catch that? He is sentenced to death because he is found falling all over the queen, right? He's not sentenced to death because of the edict he made for the Jews, but he's sentenced to death because the king comes in and sees him too close to his queen, and then they cover him with a face, and boom, he's gone. Which I think is very interesting, and I hadn't really even noticed that until this time. It kind of reminds me about, like, you know, you have like a mob boss. Let's say this is kind of weird. Did you know my family has ties to the mob? It's kind of weird. It's a long story. But like, so say you have like a mob boss, right? Known criminal. People know. Authorities know. But how often do they actually go to prison for these terrible, heinous like crimes they commit? Not very often, right? What do a lot of like career criminals end up going to prison for? Not paying taxes. Tax evasion, right? There are a lot of crimes that they can't get proved, or maybe they can't get the witnesses, or maybe witnesses are afraid to testify, right? Yeah. Called what? Rico? Yeah, so they get him on something else. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, and so that's kind of what I feel like happens here, right? There's actually not really a way for the king to punish Haman for this edict without also getting himself in trouble, right? Because remember, the edict has the stamp of the king's approval on it. The king gave him the signet ring. And so in order to condemn Haman for this edict that would kill all the Jews, Xerxes has to condemn himself. It's also something that cannot be changed even by the king himself. And so whatever the situation was, whether he was begging, whether he was getting aggressive, we don't know. But Xerxes comes in at a moment where Haman is caught in a bad position, and it's a good thing because he couldn't get him on one, but he could get him on the other. And so it's really funny because Haman, I say funny, I mean like ironic, because Haman sentences the Jews to death for something they are not guilty for. And then Haman ends up getting sentenced to death for something he actually wasn't guilty for, even though he deserved the justice that was coming. The honor that Haman planned for himself, if you remember, was given to Mordecai. Remember that? Whenever the king goes to Haman and is like, Haman, what should we do for someone the king honors? And Haman's like, oh, he's talking about me. Here's what you should do. And then he says, okay, go do that for Mordecai. And so all of the honor that Haman had been scheming to get is given to Mordecai. And then Haman in his anger creates this pole that he is going to kill Mordecai and hang him on. And while the honor that Haman so desperately wanted was given to Mordecai, the death that he so desperately wanted Mordecai to endure, he instead endures. And what we see in this passage is a lot of reversal. In fact, the whole book of Esther is all about reversal. You have things one way, and then they get flipped upside down again and again and again. And isn't that the gospel? What we have here is we see God's justice played out through divine providence. But what we also can look at is the reversal that we see through Jesus Christ. You see, Haman deserved death. But according to Scripture, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And even though Haman just jumps off of these pages as he is like textbook villain. And it's really easy to look at him and to be like, man, he's the bad guy and he deserved what he got and blah, 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 blah. But then do we ever need to be reminded that we haven't gotten what we deserve? That if all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that Scripture tells us that sin leads to death. And yet in a book of reversals, may we also be pointed to the gospel and to Jesus, who once again comes and reverses everything and flips everything upside down. I was reading a really interesting perspective of if Haman was falling all over Esther, like if he was begging and pleading for his life, was he repentant? I read a really interesting just thought piece on that this week. And the thing is, it's very, very easy and natural to our human nature to self-preserve, right? So I got to be honest, I don't really think that Haman was repentant. I think he just didn't want to die. And sometimes when it comes to our relationship with God and our relationship with Jesus, are we self-preserving or are we repentant? Because I really believe that if Haman had truly been repentant, that this story might have, I don't know, it might have ended differently. But when we find ourselves like Haman, accused of the sin in our lives, accused of the things that we've done, accused and they're brought out to light, is our first instinct to self-preserve? Oh, I don't want to get punished. Oh, I don't want to face consequences. Oh, I don't want to have to deal with that. Or is our response to repent, to really grieve for what we have done, and then to turn and walk in a new direction? So, at this point, Haman is out of the story, but the Jews are still at this moment sentenced to death. I wonder at this point what Esther's thought is. Is there still hope to save our people? Is there still time for the rest of this to turn around? So I invite you back next week and this week if you want to read chapter 8 to kind of prepare and come ready. And we're going to continue to see how that wraps up next Sunday. Now, before you guys leave today, I'm going to invite Jill Carney to come up. Jill is our church board secretary, and I had kind of mentioned last week that we just wanted... I love it. Woo, go Jill. I had kind of mentioned last week that she was just going to come up and give us a little bit of a update, and so she's going to do that at this time, and then we will dismiss.
Please do. Good morning. Pretty quiet, like, uh-oh, what's coming? I have to find, just hang on a sec, I gotta find my notes.